This video is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com. Use the code STACK at checkout to get 5% off your order, and you'll help support the show. In Magic, we have a comprehensive rule set with a design that encourages certain kinds of interaction. Both players traditionally start at 20 life, play 40 to 60 card decks, and with 1 land a turn are encouraged to play spells that both curve in mana value and progressively develop your board into a winning position, usually by combat. There are, of course, exceptions. EDH is notorious for being hostile for combat-based decks with 3 opponents worth of interaction and a combined opposing life total of 120 to contend with. But even then, design has been catching up to current play patterns, encouraging all of us to go back to our roots and punch each other in the dick. What's relevant is that there's an expectation of mutual resources among all players. We all have 1 land a turn, even if green can get more. We all have creatures for combat, even if white gets to go wider and red gets to be sharper. We all have spells, even if blue exclusively gets counter magic, and we all have interaction, even if black gets the best of it. So what's the core color identity of stickers? Hi, my name is Calvin Trigger. I'm Trigger. This is Trigger on the Stack. The channel is called The Stack, and the show idea name was called Trigger on the Stack. You remember that video from 7 years ago? I don't. Don't worry about this background back here. Don't worry about all this gray and that unfortunate light source right there. We're working on it. Things are moving around. I've been in a place. Don't listen. I'm out of the place, but I'm building a place, and there's another place, and we're gonna talk about stuff today. Spoilers have been happening this last week. We need to be more proactive about reacting to those spoilers because we have a dream of being more than just tied to gameplay videos. But you know, I want to take a second, just a second, in order to practice my chops with looking at this Space Bellerin card. And I want to talk about stupid points. I want to talk about my favorite thing in games. Okay, let's back up. Back up. When I say stupid points, this is a loving term. I'm talking about resources and mechanics that are in a game that incidentally circumvent the traditional means of interaction towards victory, and if poorly managed, might create a cluttered game board, and you might have an unreadable mess. The goal isn't to have an unreadable mess, but the goal is to play on some separate axis of gameplay that will result in your victory, but normal interaction doesn't really play with. Imagine in Yu-Gi-Oh! Exodia, you're trying to build a deck that can draw into the 5 pieces of Exodia, which means you're not really committing the board with monsters, spells, and traps at Yu-Gi-Oh! Equivalent of Doomblade, I think Raigeki right now, but that's banned, right? Or is it not banned? I don't know. Normal interaction doesn't interact with. I'm a writer. Exodia still says you win the game. It is still this point that you're trying to collect into your hand. And at the end of it, you win the game. That's it. That's your strategy. But if there are counters to that strategy, they aren't usually played, at least in the metagame or in the average deck. Besides probably beating your face in before you can win. These are ways to play the game that compel at least the player piloting these strategies to represent something weird on the game board that nevertheless brings them closer to victory. And we're going to grade them. We're going to talk about all the weird, stupid points that exist in the game of Magic. I'm going to grade them. I'm going to talk about my favorites. I'm going to talk about my least favorites. I'm going to point at the one that I think is worst for Commander. And then we're going to talk about why Space Bellerin is probably fine. The whole point of this video is to at least put some insight as to why I do the things that I do. I swear to God, at the end of the day, I'm not a troll. I don't like the card Scrambleverse. But the weird parts of Magic are my favorite parts of Magic. So, nevertheless, have you thought about Cool Stuff Inc? Yeah. Alright, to go chronologically, at least as best I can, let's talk about alternate win conditions. Coalition Victory is banned in EDH, but there's always been an incentive in card games for players like me to build towards these explicit game-ending scenarios since at least I was a small child building Exodia piles, and I think Coalition Victory is about as old. 2 notoriously overhyped win conditions in Commander include Mill and Infect, engaging at angles that circumvent traditional counterplay. Door to Nothingness is another ancient example, with Strixhaven and Stadium being the latest iteration of that design. And then perhaps the best modern day example of alternate win cons is Maze's End. Lands in particular could be a category of stupid points all their own. Competitive play tends to never have too many powerful land effects legal at the same time, since a land drop is not a counterable effect, and in EDH, land destruction is frowned upon enough that your Winggrace players grow in ego. Maze's End sneaks a literal win condition through your land drops, and asks that you play enough gate lands to satisfy said condition. It's slow, but the Maze's End player is likely a control player wrapping the board enough to reach that end stage. Probably the most generic example of stupid points. If you have an ultimate win condition, it's very explicit. I'm a Maze's End deck. Everyone knows what you're trying to do. This is how you're going to close the game. And it immediately brings to the table the biggest weakness of stupid points, the biggest weakness of trying to play on this alternate access. You're going to be punched to death. So at the end of the day, I'm going to personally, rate alternate win conditions as a solid fine for stupid points. Your typical Mazes Zen deck will have to go through the rule 0 conversation. And at the end of the day, most alternate win conditions suffer the same result as mill. I'm going to punch your dick to death. Planeswalkers at one point fit this category mechanic as well. It wasn't until Theros with the printing of Heroes downfall that we started getting direct interaction for them. And recently the card type Planeswalker has been bundled with creatures frequently enough that they are no longer foreign objects. They also do die to combat, but that was the crux of their elusiveness. Planeswalkers are typically measured on how well they protect themselves from combat, and typically are paired with Wraths and Stacks to protect them further. Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, alongside Lingering Souls and Day Judgment are my personal example. This is my core memory of when I was a Standard player. They came out about the time I started playing Magic, and they are the reason I love to do everything that I do. Lingering Souls is my favorite card, but the best example of when this was the most oppressive was probably Jace the Mind Sculptor being standard legal. Bouncing an opposing creature followed by brainstorming each turn into the answer made it impossible, almost, to keep up with it, short of using an old legend rule and casting Jace Beleren with the secret adventure mode sorcery, each opponent sacrifices their Jace. Nowadays it's Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, but generally Planeswalkers aren't nearly as oppressive. Hero's Downfall is an uncommon now, and there's enough card advantage baked into every creature that a single Planeswalker probably can't keep up. Emblems might offer a headache to typical play, especially since they aren't objects you can interact with. But emblems like Chandra, Awakened Infernos are only scariest when she's cast into an empty board, and typically emblems don't disable counterplay beyond disenchant or counterspell. Planeswalkers and emblems are a category of stupid points because loyalty counters, non-creature permanents, again, your Day Judgment effects and your disenchants aren't going to interact with the things I'm putting into play. But they do die to combat, they do encourage, us all playing creatures to try and punch each other. And at the end of the day, my gut is that Planeswalkers are so slow, especially in Commander, that forgive me if I built a Super Friends deck that wants to have Chandra emblems to close out the game. The problem you're going to have is mostly going to come to the Day of Judgment, not the Chandra herself. So I'm going to rate Planeswalkers as great. I'm going to rate them as just excellent because they encourage combat. I want to encourage combat in Commander, and maybe I'm biased, but you wanted to punch Jace in the dick anyways, so I think I'm right. Energy counters are something I probably should talk about here. They came from Kaladesh, the set with all those really expensive copies of artifacts, but they were the first time the internet had a chance to collectively groan at a new mechanic that spices up the game. I don't know if I'm being hyperbolic with that sentence. I remember when I got into the game around Innistrad, the internet still hadn't quite gathered momentum on, reacting and responding to spoilers and whatnot. Nowadays, the internet has, caught up, and I think that's part of the reason why the spoiler hype season never ends, but I don't know, comment down below if you miss the old spoiler magazines from 1995. Yeah, there were grumblings about Planeswalkers for sure, but the first Planeswalker cards were printed in 2007, which, oh god. Cards like Attune with Aether, Rogue Refiner, and Aetherworks Marvel were the bane of a lot of Magic players' journey, since energy was this new resource that you didn't interact with, and the payoff, at least for Standard, proved to be too powerful, ending with 2 of those cards getting banned. Functionally, energy counters are just charge counters, but from Mirrodin. They're just charge counters from Mirrodin, but you put them on yourself, and so anything that you have that cares about energy gets to extract from that same pool of energy, which is you. You are the energy. You really can just correlate it with mana, but it's mana that doesn't float away at the end step, and then they tried to balance it accordingly, and, well, for Standard, they failed. I tried looking up what cards do interact with counters on a player, and all I could find was Sun Cleanser, which does a pretty good job of it technically, but this card came out 2 years after Kaladesh, so I can't say it really helped. The elephant in the room is that nowadays, nobody really cares about energy counters. Aside from their legacy, Commander players don't really bring up cards like Aetherworks Marvel, despite being the constructed powerhouse it is, since it needs a little too much extra push to be something useful in your 99. And you can see with cards like Attune with Aether how the balancing that wasn't enough for Standard is likely overshadowed in EDH. It is worth mentioning that energy counters can't be interacted with, at least easily, and accumulating these can come across as increasing a number that doesn't matter to most of the table until suddenly it does. Energy counters probably best fit the description of stupid points. It's literally a point going up on your body. Even if I'd rate it as a just fine. Probably helps that they're scared shitless of breaking energy again, but like, I mean, they're going to at some point. We're going back to Kaladesh at some point, right? I can see them doing it for Commander because it'd be funny to them. Be funny to them. What is that tone? It would be funny. Funny. It would be funny. Eminence is something else that I would define as stupid points. A mechanic that technically has little to no direct counterplay, but we don't need to talk about it much because it exists on 4 Commander cards. And everybody agrees Eminence is bad for the game. Eminence refers to abilities on commanders that work when the commander is still in your command zone, though also on the battlefield. Oloro predates the official name, but I reckon you can include him in the list as well. And so yeah, the 4 cards. Arabo is the one that everyone forgets since giant growth on a cat creature on your combat is incredibly unimpressive. Inala usually only comes up when somebody wants to do something stupid, and there are better combos anyways. The Dragon and Edgar Markov are really the only 2 notorious ones. And if you want to make a fuss about them, why? The Dragon is just Dragon Tribal, right? Trying to cast the dragons a little sooner. And I don't know, I feel like that still dies to a supreme verdict. And then Edgar Markov is this vampire tribal token aggressive strategy, right? It's trying to do the combat. And I don't know, I feel like that dies to a supreme verdict. Both these commanders are a known quantity. We know exactly what they're going to do when they sit down at the table, and the thing that they're trying to do is notoriously weak in commander, right? So, I don't know, personal rating is Eminence is probably bad for the game, but so long as the list never grows beyond these 2 cards, who cares? Who cares? It shouldn't be you. That's the point of this video. You shouldn't care about anything. You should only care about subscribing to my SoundCloud, link down below. Monarch, however, is one of the best mechanics introduced to the game, even if it was the first example of the complexity creep that's dooming us all right now. If you become the Monarch, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card. If you deal combat damage to the Monarch, you become the Monarch. That's it. That's the mechanic. Introduced in Conspiracy 2 Electric Boogaloo, the intent behind the mechanic was to encourage combat in a multiplayer environment, where typically players instead pillow fort and wait for somebody else to make that first move, since trading resources with one opponent made you fall behind 2 others. Commander! Unless you're playing at CEDH levels, trading Monarch is an excellent way of keeping the game of Commander rolling, and typically, combat is a surefire way to end a game. Don't kid yourselves though, this is complexity creep. Once the Monarch is introduced, the Monarch stays forever. Put a pin in that. Put a pin in that idea. It stays forever. You can't get rid of it, except by finishing the game. If somehow the Monarch loses the game without being dealt combat damage, the current or next active player is made the Monarch instead. Once you introduce royalty, you can never get rid of it. I don't know if there's a life lesson there in the real world. This is where I'm supposed to put in a Queen joke, but like, I'm from America, so I don't spill the tea. We spilled the tea, do you get it? It's raspberry tea, or strawberry lemonade. Is this not tea? And Monarch did directly impact Legacy, at least with what I saw happen to Death and Taxes. This is a sort of weird complexity creep that does impact the game for some people, as essentially they're Planeswalker emblems that can be interacted with, even if in weird ways, but then are balanced differently as a result. I'd rate Monarch as excellent for Commander, and weird for everything else. It's probably the platonic ideal of like what a new mechanic should do for the game, especially in Commander, but the trouble is they've made it. It's done. Monarch is the thing. How do you iterate beyond drawing a card on your end step? Well, they tried that. They did do that. They did iterate from it. And people are angry. And I hate you all. Real quickly, I'm supposed to talk about the City's Blessing, I think, as well as experience counters, I think, since they do fall under this definition of stupid points. Perhaps experience counters directly so, like energy. But I've yet to see a gameplay moment defined by effects that care in a way that made me feel stupid for unpacking it. While they do keep printing legendary creatures that care about experience, the fact that they keep printing them as legendary encourages players to have only one at a time, making them kind of no different from Skullbriar with spicy sauce added to the top. Answer honestly, who was the last person you met excited about having the City's Blessing? Phonos Hunger. I play that in Edgar Markov sometimes, because the tokens contribute to the City's Blessing. That's it. Maybe I should play Arch of Araska more, I don't know. But like, do you really care? Ultimately, I rate these 2 mechanics as so inoffensive that I usually forget that they are mechanics in the first place. Whatever your opinion is on Skullbriar, the Welcome Grave ought to be the same for these 2. Mutate, however. is about the most offensive you can get. Introduced in Ikoria, Mutate is about as parasitic a mechanic as you can get. To get the most out of the mechanic, you need to play as many cards of Mutate as possible, which they haven't really made since Ikoria, considering the rules nightmare they impose. These are stickers. We're not really going to talk about stickers later because every problem with stickers is the problems with Mutate, except Mutate has even more. Mutate is worse than stickers, is the point. Take that away. We're not really talking about stickers today, but just remember that. Mutate, stickers, the legend super type is a thing. Stickers don't change that. Mutate's a problem. New commanders in Ivy and Riddiman, Mutate compatible themselves, give players weird logistic nightmares to pilot should they design into them. And typically are weird logistic nightmares these players are giddy to impose onto the table. The group at large isn't compelled to have their own Mutate extra deck of sorts, but playing against the Mutate stack is the fastest way to lose track of whatever is happening on board, as the Ivy player stacks tokens of all sorts of cards on top of one another to enigmatic results. So like where an emblem is just adding an effect to the game, maybe adding an effect to a player, Mutate is literally changing the characteristic of something. Again, stickers, we're changing the characteristics of your card. But there are ways to abuse the fact that the card, the object, has different characteristics that can make a game of Commander very confusing. In specific, it will come up with, say, the legend rule. You mutate on top of Ivy, but you make the mutate creature card you just cast be the topmost card, which means it's no longer the legendary creature Ivy, it's just a non-legendary creature. And with Riddiman, you mutate on top of your legendary creatures, keep the legend on top, sacrifice the legendary creature, it keeps the new token Riddiman makes, keeps all the mutate stuff. And that's weird. And I don't know how you're prepared to represent that on board. I'm personally not. I would rate mutate as very bad. Very bad? Yeah, Mutate is a very bad mechanic for a game of Commander, normally, because it's very hard to clearly communicate what the fuck is going on. But if someone sits down to play a Mutate stack, they are usually prepared to do that effectively. Adrian's Ivy deck has a literal extra deck to clearly communicate the Mutate stack, so, you know. Yeah, at some point, obviously, we need to talk about dungeons. Venture into the dungeon is probably high on a lot of folks' shit list, and I hate you all for it. Cards that venture are typically conservatively costed, at least the standard legal ones. There are some Commander outliers. And the dungeons themselves are really no more offensive than the Monarch mechanic. Monarch lets you draw a card every end step, and there's not much you can iterate on top of that that wouldn't demand some massive rebalancing or wouldn't just be an underwhelming comparison. The new Monarch lets you scry 3. And then from there, if you try to and after you do it so many times, something different happens, congratulations, you made dungeon. Venture into the dungeon is a mechanic that can exist in every color, and if you measure each dungeon room as costing about, I don't know, 3 mana to enter, you more or less get full exposure to the colorless slice of the color pie rather than anything offensive. Dungeon of the Mad Mage ends on a crazy payoff, Doom of Annihilation gives you consistent chip damage throughout, and Lost Mine of Fandelver is generically good value at each room, but again, if each room costs about 3 mana, how offensive are they really? It's stupid points because a dungeon is not an object you can interact with, and they do a lot of variable effects. But they're also public information, and rooms that do affect opposing permanents are temporary slowdown effects, as well as being telegraphed a mile away. And honestly, when dungeons first came out, they were just about as parasitic as Mutate was. If you wanted to build a dungeon deck, you kind of just had to invest in the original D&D set. Maybe some of the Commander precons could help, but you were more or less limited to that theme deck. So really, it's just a theme Monarch deck. Who gets angry about a theme Monarch deck? I'm going to rate dungeons as fine, if only because most venture cards are pretty conservatively costed, rendering most dungeon decks theme decks more than anything else. And even if you have a way to go wild with dungeon triggers, Radiant Solar is also my favorite Magic card. Unless an infinite is in play, more Scry 1 and more treasure token, more 1 treasure token every 4 ETBs is it. You can probably ignore that in Commander. And if you can ignore your opponent's main mechanic and the incremental value it generates, yikes. Day and Night, however, is the worst fucking thing in the world. This exists as a fix to the werewolf mechanic from Innistrad blocks of the past, tying werewolves to a game value tracked separate from themselves. And for werewolves, Tovolar players are exempt from everything I'm about to say, because those players are prepared to pay for their sins and accommodate the other players as they dig their teeth into me. But in fixing the werewolf mechanic, WotC has given us the worst possible thing in a game of EDH that, to this day, demands anybody that plays a single Day and Night card in their Commander decks apologize for every time they cast said card. and that includes me, because the Celestis is legendary, and I put that in Dihada because it's legendary, and it's a mana rock, and that's important, so I have to apologize. Needless upkeep triggers. Like Monarch, like Dungeons, like the City's Blessing, there are no external means of removing the cycle. Once introduced, it's designed to stay forever, which is what enables werewolves to track what their creatures are going to be, what they're going to do later in the game when they cast them. But if every game piece that cares about day and night are removed from the game, technically the triggers still happen. Technically, the day and night cycle persists, which is what would happen on Moto or Arena despite no longer having any meaningful effect on the game. Oh god, that is a arena mechanic. It's really only easy when the computer does it for you. Furthermore, it's suddenly the responsibility of the active player to check, which makes this a game mechanic that does impose a mental upkeep cost on everyone else for the rest of the game. Again, the Tovolar player is going to happily do it for you, but everyone that plays only a splatter and a daybound cards, there's no guarantee. This is exacerbated by when the werewolf player is dead, but the Legends player might draw their Celestis at some point, so technically we can't casually decide to ignore it for the rest of the game. I rate this mechanic, this stupid point, as the absolute worst, because I did not sign up. Man, I have a joke written right here, and I have to read it, but I have to look at the camera. I did not sign up to think about sunlight when I wanted to get together with the boys and play games. We block out the windows to control the lighting, and usually I wear all black anyway, so like, you think I want to be seen? Like, comment, subscribe. And last thing before we actually talk about Unfinity, yeah, let's talk about taking the initiative. This is a mechanic that I'll talk more in depth about in another video, because full transparency, I rate this as excellent. This is very good. This is very good for a game of Commander. Also, it's very bad for a game of Commander. I will acknowledge where it brings issues, but if Monarch is the platonic ideal, I think this is better Monarch. Taking the initiative is essentially venturing into the dungeon, becoming the Monarch. It's handled by the rules the same as Monarch, but it triggers when you take it or on your upkeep if you already had it. And all that does is trigger venturing into the dungeon. Okay, so like, it's complexity creep in that the trigger, taking the initiative, triggers venture into the Undercity. And when you venture and you go into a dungeon room, that is its own trigger. So like, where Monarch is just draw a card and the trigger's done, this is 3 triggers altogether. Hi, my name is Trigger. One of the big points of complexity is that venturing into the Undercity is the only way to enter the dungeon, the Undercity, which is probably the fairest way to introduce more dungeons into the game without breaking it in half cards like Nadar. But then once you're in the Undercity, regular venture still works, suddenly evolving the original mechanic to new heights. So the reason that it's so great, is that the first and the last rooms of the Undercity are probably the best rooms that exist in any of these dungeons, right? And then it keeps on going in a game. Once you introduce the initiative, it's like Monarch, it's introduced, it stays there forever, so you don't need to play another venture card or another take the initiative card in order to get the full effects. Also, the rest of the board doesn't need to have a single card in order to get any of the effects once you introduce it, just like Monarch. And then the way to take it is, through combat, just like Monarch. You gotta punch someone in the dick in order to take the initiative. You take the initiative and you become the Monarch, which means we're encouraging combat. This is really good. This is really good for a game of Commander, isn't it? Don't you want people to punch each other? What I like the most about taking the initiative is you can't ignore it like you can Dungeons, or maybe you can the Monarch, because the final reward, that final room in the Undercity, is this massive cheat into play, turn hexproof and turn beefy effect that technically has the variance of it being the top 10 cards, so you can't control what that creature's gonna be, but man, is that going to really impact a game of Commander. So like, again, this is excellent and terrible. The rating here is excellent and terrible. This does everything we want for a game of Commander and encourages us to close out the game. It smooths out your deck in that first room. I didn't even get to say that. It smooths out budget mana bases so well. But like, if you're not personally prepared to touch the initiative, it's, yeah, I can see it being frustrating. More so than the Monarch. You can ignore the Monarch. It's harder to ignore the initiative. So like, I get it. But also you're wrong. The thing that you're gonna wanna do anyways, when I say that you're wrong, is you're gonna wanna punch me, which means you're gonna take the initiative anyway, so like, who gets the last laugh? Which finally brings us a Space Cowboy himself. We're skipping stickers, since the extra deck compels enough variance on top of the inherent variance of your main deck, that if I say, refer to my notes on energy and mutate, but remember that it's less effective than either, I'm likely not to be proven wrong, though it will be my pleasure to put in the work to try and prove myself wrong there. But Space Bellerin, the specific card we're talking about today, besides the fact that he burnt the first multicolored Jace on a gag, the truth is, he's fine. It's not that complicated because it's really easy to ignore. Not really easy to manage necessarily, it's really easy to ignore. So Space Bellerin has 3 abilities that do generic white-blue nonsense to creatures in play, but the catch is Space Cowboy cares about where these creatures are floating in space. He enters the battlefield, and all creatures before and after need to be declared as existing in an alpha, beta, or gamma vector. The owner of Jace gets the advantage at first since they'll pick their sectors last, but after that it's the eternal raging river where once your choice is made, it's locked forever. So in a very white-blue way, it's all of those red chaos cards, Raging River, Scrambleverse. You get that sort of vibe from it in a very white-blue way. So, you know, stupid points. And we're rearranging the board in a weird way that might be hard to track, right? Now, personally, I've never been a fan of chaos effects besides the once-in-a-while gag because as far as my definition of stupid points goes, cards like Scrambleverse tend to fail in a very specific way. How are you winning the game? Technically, Scrambleverse is only better than, say, Troll casting Armageddon with no plan because everyone still has their lands. And technically, you can build into your Scrambleverse by having no non-land permanents in play, but at that point, yeah, you are profiting, but you're profiting by having a random assortment of every other non-land permanent in play that your opponents control. And I guess you can try and construct a win from that, but you can't plan for it. You can't plan for it. I can plan with taking the initiative. I can plan with Space Bellerin. You can't plan with Scrambleverse. The point is you can't plan with Scrambleverse. I don't like chaos cards personally. And like, yeah, once we all agree that it can be very annoying to have to divide your game mat into 3 lanes when Space Jace comes into play, I'd like to remind you of 3 things. 1, Space Bellerin literally only does stuff on his turn. If he ticks up, the creatures can't block outside their lane for only that turn. It's not an effect that cycles through the round, so you can just punch his dick. There's nothing stopping you. 2, I'm struggling to imagine a board of creatures that isn't both too big to manage with the 3 lanes and isn't too big to manage to begin with. Like, if you like having massive board states, you probably already do what you can to divide your creatures in a way that clearly communicates the massive amount of cards to your opponents, despite being in a stack of 20 guys, right? And that's going to be the board state that's going to be hard to pick out into alpha, beta, and gamma, but it was already hard. And if your board state has like 3 creatures, that's not going to be hard. But third, and this is the big one, there's nothing stopping the rest of the table from only committing the rest of their creatures to alpha and gamma, compelling Space Bellerin to put everything he has into being a beta, which is very funny. Okay, so Space Bellerin comes down, and if you decide to make things easier on myself, I'm just gonna put everything into alpha. I'm just gonna be an alpha. Not only is that very funny, but like, the worst thing you're doing is letting Space Bellerin be a slightly more efficient Venser the Sojourner, a card I don't think most of us remember, most of us think about. Yeah, you put everything in just one sector and Space Bellerin gets to put everything in another sector, and then, you know, all his creatures are unblockable. But this is a 4-mana, white-blue, sorcery speed effect. Probably could have done that anyways, and like, you know, that's not the min-max approach to the game, right? If someone plays Space Bellerin, you're supposed to want to try and divide your creatures in an efficient way in order to min-max the response to combat, but like, I don't know. This is a casual game of Magic. If we're already in a position where like, we've decided that we're not going to play Mana Crypt, which is probably the only environment that Space Bellerin gets to see play in, then we've probably already agreed that just having a fun game to do fun things is what we want, right? And if it ends up you throw the game in order to make the joke, I'm gonna commit everything to alpha, and that means that you have to commit into being a beta, that's funny. Probably a problematic joke, but also it's funny. So I don't know, we would all make it. And then the Space Bellerin player gets to be like, haha, yeah, I guess I'm a beta, but then he kills you anyways. And like, I don't know, Jace is kind of a twink, right? I mean, this whole conversation feels a little weird now that I'm saying it out loud. Now, you might be thinking these sectors are as annoying as the day-night mechanic, since technically once introduced, it never goes away. But the gotcha is, it's only Jace that cares here, so far. And it only matters on Jace's turn, unless a Super Friends player was winning anyways. So once Jace is dealt with, it's actually very easy to ignore the mechanic for the rest of the game. Like, technically, yeah, if they print more black bordered cards that care about these sectors, I guess this point loses a little bit of muster. The whole problem with day and night is, once introduced, there's still a chance that someone else can have the card. And like, yeah, I have the Celestis, so if the werewolf player dies and I haven't drawn the Celestis, we still kind of have to track the mechanic. Not only am I predicting they're not going to print anymore, because yeah, it is a headache, and they have a lot more to worry about in Unfinity, and with all the stickers and everything else. Even if they do, you just put everything into alpha and it. Just say, herbaderb, I'm just gonna be an alpha. You should do that. That's the solution. I remember reading somewhere on Twitter that like, there's a reason they didn't make it alpha, beta, and omega, and like everyone in the comments, the thread was like, ha ha ha. But like, I didn't quite get it because I don't know what an omega is. And again, this conversation now feels weird, and I'm gonna eventually learn what an omega is. And I don't think my life's gonna be different. You saw the Strixhaven video. So I was wrong. I learned what it is, and in the explanation my wife gave me, I was reminded about nodding, and now my life is nothing but pain. So yeah, Space Bellerin is not Scrambleverse. This is not Raging River. It is silly, but fuck you, Twitter. I'm gonna put this and a bunch of other Planeswalkers in a deck with Taking the Initiative and other things to support my Esper Creature Tokens deck, because not only is it silly, it's good. Adrian, Aiden, and Guy will put all of their creatures into Alpha and Gamma, and I'll be forced to put mine into Beta, which will be very funny for chat, haha. And then 3 times I'll spend Jace to pump my dudes, haha. Because what the fuck else am I expected to do in my Space Marine token army? That's right. That's right. That's right. Jace, Space Jace with the space gun, he's going into the Space Marine army deck. That's what's gonna fucking happen. Fuck your magic cannon. Space Bellerin has excellent synergy with the Flesh is Weak from Warhammer 40k, and we are just Marnius Calger, whatever. He's gonna get ripped because Space Bellerin's gonna come down, and there's nothing you can do about it. Then I'm gonna play Cigar Summon, and my Space Marine's also gonna be an RFX Angel weird thing. I'm gonna put Will the Wise in there just to fuck with you, and then why not Radiant Solar? Because I'm gonna have the initiative because I am the creature deck, and there's nothing you can do about it because fuck. Like, it's just going to be a budget Esper mid-range deck at the end of the day. It's not like I'm casting actual Chaos cards. So what do you think? Do you like this synopsis of stupid points? Did I enlighten some of our audience as to why I do the things that I do? Are you excited for Space Bellerin and Infinity? Or do you hate Magic and everything that it stands for now? Do you have a Joanne's Fabrics gift card for $200? Let me know in the comments below. Later we'll talk about Taking Initiative more in depth because I swear by it for budget. Maybe when I write that script, it won't be 13 pages long. And, yeah. Thanks for watching. See you next time.